You've entered the Rock is Lit Vault.
Welcome to the Rock is Lit Vault, where you can find outtakes from the regular episodes and extended episodes, as well as special features, behind-the-scenes peeks, and breaking news. Join me, Christy Alexander Hallberg, for each enthralling episode, then migrate to the vault for Rock is Lit Deep Cuts. Episode 14 of Rock is Lit features Michael Amos Cody's novel Gabriel Songbook, a story that follows starry-eyed Gabriel Tanner on his quest to strike it big as a singer-songwriter in Nashville in the 1980s. In the final segment of that episode, Cooper and Frye Gaillard joined me to talk about the real Nashville music scene in the 1980s. Frye is an historian and author of such books as A Hard Rain, America in the 1960s, The Southernization of America, which he co-wrote with Pulitzer Prize-winner Cynthia Tucker, and Watermelon Wine, The Spirit of Country Music. On a sad note, the morning episode 14 first aired, I received a message from Frye Gaillard giving me the tragic news that Cooper had passed away just 2 days prior, on Tuesday, December 6, 2022. Cooper was the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum's senior director, producer, and writer. As one of Nashville's most respected music journalists, he wrote for The Tennessean, American Songwriter, Esquire, and numerous other publications. His insight was deepened by his experiences as a Grammy-nominated producer, a singer, a songwriter, and a touring musician. His songs were recorded by luminaries, including John Prine, Todd Snider, and Country Music Hall of Fame members Bobby Bare and Mac Wiseman. Country Music Hall of Fame member Chris Christopherson said, Cooper looks at the world with an artist's eye and a human heart and soul. What you're about to hear is the full interview I recorded with Frye Gaillard and Cooper on Tuesday, October 18, 2022, less than 2 months before Peter's death. I offer it to you now as a tribute to Peter, in honor of his life, and in gratitude for the insight he and Frye brought to episode 14 of Rock is Lit about Michael Amos Cody's novel Gabriel Songbook, a book Peter so enjoyed. I wish all of Peter's friends and family peace and healing. And now, here is my conversation with Frye Gaillard and Cooper. Welcome to the podcast, Frye and Peter. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Christy.
Thank you.
So the focus of this episode is Michael Amos Cody's novel Gabriel Songbook, which follows the character Gabriel Tanner on his quest to strike it big as a singer-songwriter in Nashville in the 1980s. I think to fully appreciate all the changes taking place in Nashville in the 1980s, let's go back to the 1970s first. Frye, your book, Watermelon Wine, deals primarily with Nashville and country music in the 70s. So what was the country music scene like during that decade, and who were some of the major stars?
You know, Guy Clark, one of the great songwriters to come to Nashville in the 1970s, compared it once to being in Paris in the days of Ernest Hemingway.
Oh, wow.
It was for some of those guys and women too, that it was art for art's sake.
Yeah.
That wasn't true for everybody, but it was for Guy Clark or Jesse Winchester or Townes Van Zandt. Tom T. Hall, though he was on the country charts, he was primarily a storyteller who just, told his stories through music. That was the way it was in Nashville in those days. And, it was exciting to write about it. And you could feel the other tension of commercialization sort of building as well. And so it wasn't Nirvana, but it was a great time. I remember a song that a friend of mine named Vince Matthews wrote that Gordon Lightfoot later recorded. It was called On Susan's Floor, and it was about how songwriters like himself just crashed on the floor of this woman that they knew who was generous enough to put a roof over their heads so they could go out and ply their trades. That was just kind of the spirit of Nashville in those days.
Mm-hmm. When I think of country music in the 70s, I think of outlaw country. Think of people like Waylon Jennings and Hank Williams Jr. and Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, and that whole crowd, and the urban cowboy scene. That's what immediately comes to mind for me.
Yeah, and it was that for sure, that was part of it as well. And those people were doggedly creative and also and determined to control their own art. And they sometimes fought with the moguls of the music industry for their own creative independence. And then on the women's side of the issue of the scene, you had Loretta Lynn, you had Martin, you had Emmylou Harris, Linda Ronstadt was in and out of town. So again, you just had some, in my opinion, really great stuff on the country music charts as well as in the little clubs that dotted the landscape around town.
Yeah, and there was the rise of Southern rock and country rock. So that, all of these different kind of branches of rock and country were sort of coming together during that time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. David D. Bumgardner, who is director of the creative writing minor at East Tennessee State University, called Gabriel's Songbook the best novel of the music business he's read in a long time. Peter, you wrote a new introduction to the reissue of Watermelon Wine that updates the book's themes. Can you bridge the gap between Nashville and country music of the 70s and 80s? I mean, what were some of the differences in not only the music, but also the music business?
There were some gaps, but in a lot of ways, the 1980s, I don't know, there was a lot of great country music there in the 80s. And that's, I was a high school kid listening to Nashville music, and Emmylou Harris, who Frye mentioned, was somebody who made popular albums in the 70s and in the 80s, and seemed to connect all of these worlds. The 80s were, for a time, a really down period commercially for country music, and then there came in the mid 80s what Steve Earle called the great credibility scare, which was critically acclaimed artists getting signed to major record label deals. People like Nancy Griffith, Steve Earle, Lyle Lovett, people, Roseanne Cash, Rodney Crowell, people who fused folk traditions and country music and were great storytelling singer-songwriters. The 80s was also when the video world seemed to open up for country music. There were a couple of dedicated country music cable video channels that gave fans the opportunity to kind of to feel like they knew these musicians. They got another window into them.
Speaking of these music channels, these music video channels, MTV debuted in August of 1981, and then CMT launched in March of 1983. So it really was from the beginning of the 80s onward that video and these music channels began to become so popular. How do you see that as impacting the people who were stars in the 70s? Could they cross over?
I think a lot of them did cross over. There was also a station called TNN, the Nashville Network, that was a big deal. And these stations were much more music substantive than tends to be the deal today. You would have some in-depth interviews. There were live shows from Opryland. People like Ralph Emery had a nightly show that would have stars of the day, legends of country music, and upstarts often on the same show. I remember actually going to a show, a Ralph Emery hosted show that featured Porter Wagner, who was a great legend of country music and is now in the Country Music Hall of Fame, and Tim O'Brien, who was a bluegrass wizard and just a wonderful, wonderful musician who was not necessarily a name, was not featured on the country charts other than as a songwriter. There exists the notion that TV made image more important in country music. And I'm not sure that that's correct. I think image has always been important in country music, just the outfits. It's always been about the song, but also more than that, about the singer of the song and the relatability of that singer. We want our singers to relate to us and also to dress better than we do.
In the novel, when the character Gabriel goes to Nashville, it is the 1980s. It's on the cusp of that change with MTV and CMT and all of that. And every music executive he encounters wants to change him. They were looking for a certain image that he didn't have. And I'm hearing you say that image has always been important in the music business. But do you think there was a certain kind of image that executives were looking for in their artists in the 80s that was a little bit different from prior decades?
I think there was a flailing away in the 80s among executives trying to figure out what would work and how it would work. Certainly the video era made record executives want to sign people who were, I don't know, like in shape. And country musicians started to look like athletes in some cases. Randy Travis was a workout hound, but also a tradition-based artist who sang songs that could have been sung in the 1950s or 60s. I don't think any of this is particular to country music. I think it's the way the industry worked and the way the world works. I don't think that it necessarily came as a detriment to the music. I think radio changed in the 90s and became with the Telecommunications Act of 1996, playlists were what you would listen to on a country station in Cleveland was a lot like what you would listen to, was in fact the same as what you would hear on a country station in Spartanburg, South Carolina. There was a homogeny that set in, but that was really the 90s. I think it's important that I don't know if it's important, but I'm interested in country music as a kind of arms expanded genre, not as a limited radio format. I can hear remarkable country music any night of the week here in Nashville. It may not be from people who are featured on country radio station. And sometimes it is. One of the best pure country singers I've ever heard is a guy named John Bird, who Frye knows. He plays little clubs on weeknights, and you won't hear a better country music show than John Bird. Now, he's not going to be featured on your commercial top 40 country station, but he is for sure a country musician. And I think that the character Gabriel in this book is working between these worlds, trying to find a way to popular success while also retaining his artistic vision. And those things are definitely hard to combine.
That's the age-old problem with the music industry in general.
Well, yeah. And we've spoken about Emmylou Harris a little bit. And Frye has done some remarkable writing on Emmylou, who is just the absolute godmother of what we now call Americana music. But it was in the 80s, she had gone from being a CMA Female Vocalist of the Year, a popular country radio artist, to being told essentially that she was put out to commercial
pasture.
And her reaction to that was not one of anger or bitterness. Her reaction to that was, well, now I can do whatever I want to do. And she embarked on kind of a second career, beginning with this Wrecking Ball album. that is not to be confused with Miley Cyrus wrecking ball. But,
no way.
But she just took that as license to do what she wanted to do. And there was still an audience there for that. It was not the audience that was listening to top 40 country radio.
Right.
So again, there's a difference between genre and format.
Yes. Well, Frye, I know that this is a bit of a deviation, but let's stay with Emmylou for a minute, because I really like the work that she did with Graham Parsons in the early 70s until he died in 73, 72, 73, something like that. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about their union and the work that they did and how she kind of bridged the gap from working with him to going solo?
She was playing little folk music clubs when she met Graham Parsons. I think she told me in an interview that I did with her in the 1990s that they met at a little folk club in Washington, D.C. called Clyde's. She was playing there, and Graham came in to hear her. And in the break between sets, they went down to the basement and sat down on a couple of different kegs of beer and started playing songs for each other. And just sort of musically, they just each found the other soulmate. And they did those amazing albums that you were talking about. And, when Graham Parsons died, it broke Emmylou's heart. And she wrote Boulder, Birmingham about him, which is one of the great songs, in my view, in the history of country music. It was on her first solo album. So, she was an amazing force who came into her own in the 1970s. I think continued to thrive in the 1980s, but by the 90s, as Peter said, she was no longer on the country charts, and she just didn't care. She just went on about, in addition to her Wrecking Ball album, she did a live album from the old Ryman Auditorium and helped resurrect it as a music venue. So, just an amazing person. She's almost like a music historian as well as a great songwriter and unbelievable singer. One other thing I was going to add to what Peter was saying, in my view, from looking down from 10,000 feet, it seems like Gabriel, the character in the fine novel that you're talking about, got to Nashville in a sort of bridge decade between the 70s that I consider a really golden age for creativity, and the 90s, when the pressures to be more cookie cutter and conforming, at least on radio, had taken root. And I think that was beginning to affect songwriters in the 1980s, and that tension between art and stardom, which is always a tension performers struggle with. I think that began to become more acute in the 1980s. Some people handled that tension really well and really easily, Emmylou being one, Dolly Parton being another. But some songwriters that I knew during that time really did struggle with it, like Gabriel did.
Yeah. And then there's Johnny Cash, for goodness sakes, who goes back to the 50s and 60s and lasted until his death and inspired these new songwriters and new ideas all into the 90s and early 2000s. What was it about Johnny Cash that made him the icon that he became?
One of the things about Johnny Cash that was always so important was that he had a very deep social conscience, I think. In 1964, he had a top 5 country hit called The Ballad of Ira Hayes, written by a Native American songwriter named Peter Lafarge. And that song about the struggles of an American Indian who had been a war hero in World War II, a true story, it made the top of the country charts because of the force of Johnny Cash's belief in those kinds of things and the distinctiveness of his voice and just his overall presence. But that identification with people on the margins was one of the things that was at the heart of Johnny Cash's greatness, I think. Late in the 1960s, when the country as a whole, the nation as a whole, seemed divided politically, and even musically. Johnny Cash, with his television show, set out deliberately to put the pieces back together. So he'd have on that show Bob Dylan, but he would have Merle Haggard as well. And so that's the kind of role that Johnny Cash tried to play, I think. I did a couple of interviews with him, which I considered a singular honor. He had this presence about him. He wasn't arrogant, but as one of his band members said, he knew who he was. But there was also in those conversations a thoughtfulness and a kindness that made a lasting impression on me. I think it did for a lot of fans. A lot of stories about Johnny Cash seeing a busload of tourists pull up in front of his house, and sometimes he would go down there and just talk to them. And there was just a kind of accessibility and availability by one of the biggest stars in the history of country music, really of any kind of music.
Yeah. Johnny Cash was present in conversation. He cared about who he was talking to, and he realized, as Frye said, he knew who he was, but he also took care to know who the person he was speaking with was. He along with Chris Christopherson, those are the two most charismatic people I've ever been around.
Wow.
If we were in a room facing one way and Johnny Cash walked into the room through a back door, the nature of the room would change. Something's different here. And we would turn around to see that Johnny Cash was there.
Those folks don't come along very often.
No. Also, I would note, Frye was talking about how Merle Haggard would be on Cash's show along with progressive, liberal-minded folk singers. Sometimes country music is, I believe, mischaracterized as a conservative genre.
I agree, Peter. I agree.
At the same time, Johnny Cash had a song called "What Is Truth" that was supporting young people who were in opposition to the Vietnam War. At the same time that Merle Haggard had a hit song that said, when you're running down this country, man, you're walking on the fighting side of me. And those guys were best friends, and they were both wise people. And Merle's politics changed a good bit over the years. It's odd to me that country music in the 1960s and 70s was a place where disparate political thoughts and thoughts about social movements could coexist. And today that has not seemed to be the case. Until fairly recently, there are more sort of liberal voices speaking out lately in country music. Jason Isbell's maybe the greatest songwriter of his generation, certainly so. And he's not featured on country radio, but he exists squarely in the squarely sounds like he's not cool or something. That's not what I mean by squarely. But he exists within the country music tradition for sure. Maren Morris, Casey Musgraves. It's more of a battle now, it seems, than it was in Cash's and Haggard's day. Those guys weren't, they might think different things at the same time, but they didn't hold it against each other.
Right.
I'm not sure what that has to do with Gabriel's story, but...
Well, that's okay. It makes for interesting conversation. Frye, jump in here. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, sometimes disparate political views, or what seemed to be, existed within the same artist. Merle had an example of that when, at the same time that he was writing Okie from Muskogee or The Fighting Side of Me, he was also writing songs out of the Woody Guthrie tradition about migrant workers in California. He had an album cut about interracial love. He wrote about Christmas time factory layoffs that affected white working class people. So Merle Haggard also had that identification with people on the margins, and I love seeing that come back around these days again with like Jason Isbell. I saw Jason not long ago at the Ryman Auditorium, and his opening act was a singer-songwriter named Peter One, who is an African who had been a country star on the Ivory Coast.
Wow.
And Peter One came to Nashville later, not to do country music, but he just immigrated to the United States and became a nurse at a medical care facility. And then his musical talent was rediscovered. And, here's Jason Isbell featuring him as an opening act just to call attention and cross that racial barrier.
Mm-hmm.
Old Crow Medicine Show has a new album with a tribute song to DeFord Bailey, a black harmonica player who was literally in 1925 the first artist to play on the Grand Ole Opry as it was named that very night. There's this kind of tradition that maybe it's almost like a river flowing underground in country music that people every now and then celebrate and always have. And I'm glad that tradition is still alive today as it was in the 80s. So, there's something universal about the character Gabriel, too. I mean, the music business changes, but that artistic aspiration endures, and all of the heartache and disappointment and joy that all of that can bring as well. So anyway, it's a great novel.
It is. So before I let you go, you mentioned the Ryman, the Grand Ole Opry. Talk about some other major music venues in Nashville from the 80s in particular. I mean, the Ryman's been around for decades and decades, but what were some of the major music venues in Nashville in the 80s, and which ones are still in operation? And either one of you can jump in here.
Peter, when did the Bluebird come along? I get that gets all fuzzy in my mind. In the 70s, a lot of it was the Exit Inn. I saw Guy Clark there and Linda Ronstadt there. And then before too much longer, it was the Bluebird that you went to, but there was also the Station Inn and other things. Peter, you live in Nashville. I don't. Tell me what's your thought on that?
Well, the Bluebird came along in the 80s and developed into this amazing place for singer-songwriters. And it was the place where the in the round concept came to fruition. In the round means there's usually 3 or 4 songwriters who sit in a circle in the middle of the room, sometimes propping their beers up on customer tables, and they sing songs one by one and interact with each other. My friend Don Schlitz, who's a Hall of Fame songwriter and a member of the Grand Ole Opry now, was involved in the beginning of this in the round concept at the Bluebird. The Station Inn remains the world's finest bluegrass venue. It's a little club. It's set in an area that's full of high rises and really expensive restaurants. From the outside, it looks like some dumpy little place, and then from the inside, it seems like heaven itself. All the greats of bluegrass music have played there, from the father of bluegrass, Bill Monroe, to the new lights of bluegrass and acoustic music like Molly Tuttle and Sierra Hull. We mentioned Tim O'Brien earlier. He's played there many, many nights. Station Inn is probably my favorite club in the world. As Frye mentioned, the Exit Inn was a place for singer-songwriters and for rock and roll, and sometimes for a convergence of those things. There's great photos I've seen of Country Music Hall of Fame member Bobby Bare playing with Shel Silverstein, who was an amazing song poet and writer of children's books and a drawer of Playboy cartoons.
It's quite a career he's had.
Was Bear's best friend, and Neil Young.
Wow.
All on stage at the Exit Inn, which is also where there was a band called Jason and the Scorchers that was the first country punk band of all time, and they played there loudly and finally. It was an amazing group, but the Exit Inn is a major part of the Nashville story. The Ryman, of course. Then there were various little clubs where things happened, but gosh, you can still go to the Station Inn or the Bluebird and hear the best music you'll ever hear on a Tuesday night. Or you can go down Gallatin Road in East Nashville and get to American Legion Hall 182 and see genuinely great country music, or Dee's Country Cocktail Lounge. You can see John Bird on a Wednesday night, and it'll blow your mind. In Gabriel's story, Gabriel had trouble kind of finding the balance between the music that was in his head and came out through his hands and was in his heart, and the music that would be popular and money making. There are people who are in Nashville now who have found the balance between those things and are doing so in great ways.
Yeah. Well, for the episode of Rock is Lit that featured Susie Quattro, I had Catherine Turman on to talk about Susie's place in rock history. And Catherine is a music journalist and producer for Alice Cooper's syndicated radio show Nights with Alice Cooper. Anyway, I asked her why Susie isn't in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame yet, and she talked about how political the selection process is and how artists need advocates promoting them. Peter, is that the same situation with the Country Music Hall of Fame?
Country Music Hall of Fame does not nominate or elect people into the Country Music Hall of Fame. That's done through the Country Music Association, the voting member thereof. And I believe it's actually one of the last true things. I don't believe it to be very political. Certainly there are people who I feel like ought to be in there who are not. But gosh, this year, Jerry Lee Lewis, who has burned more bridges than exist in some states, was elected to be a member of the Country Music Hall of Fame. It is a very exclusive Hall of Fame. There tend to be 3 new members each year. It's a little different than the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And our induction ceremony is it's called the Medallion Ceremony, and it's not televised. It's not ticketed. We aren't charging anybody for access. It's essentially a family reunion, and there does exist a country music family. It's a wonderful thing to behold.
That was fabulous. You both added so much to this episode. So I'm going to grab a screenshot, if you don't mind. Give me your best pose here.
Boy, I'm not dressed for
it. You're fine. All right, 1, 2, 3. It looks good. It's a keeper. So before I let you go, what I ask people to do is just say their name. This is Frye Gaillard, and you're listening to Rock is Lit. And Peter, I'll do that with you as well. So I'll start with you, Frye.
This is Frye Gaillard, and you are listening to Rock is Lit.
Peter?
This is Peter Cooper, and you're listening to Rock is Lit.
Lovely.
Christy, can I say something about Frye for a moment? A lot of my interest and ultimately devotion to country music came about when I was a student at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And I came across a book called Watermelon Wine that Frye wrote about country music in the 1970s. And it included just wonderful portraits of people including Tom T. Hall and Guy Clark, Townes Van Zandt. And Frye just finds the humanity in this music and in lots of other things in ways that the rest of us struggle to. So I cannot recommend that book more highly. And Frye is an absolute hero of American literature. So.
All right. This was fantastic. Thank you so much. You really added so much to the episode. I appreciate it.
And Peter, the other thing, check out Christy's novel, Searching for Jimmy Page. It's a fabulous read about rock and roll, but also coming of age. And so as long as we're admiring each other here, it's really a great book too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
I will read that just as soon as I'm finished with this Bo Jackson biography.
Oh my gosh, look at that. Wow. Okay. He's a genuinely interesting dude also.
Yeah, he is.
Thanks, Christy.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Christy. I'll read the book.
All right.
Rock is lit.